our discussions of specific types of learning, we've mentioned issues like attentional focus, for example, or elaborative encoding, and their role in better retaining new material we're learning. In this part of the course, we're shifting from looking at specific types of learning to looking at factors that can influence learning across different types of subject matter. One of these sets of factors involves three interrelated, interconnected abilities that are studied under the terms attention, working memory, and executive function. In this lecture, we're going to delve a bit deeper into some features of attention, working memory, and executive function that are useful for understanding our own learning experiences. We will take these terms in turn because they are nested within one another in some important ways. And we'll consider the evidence for the importance of these capacities in supporting or limiting learning. We will close by talking about whether and how attention, working memory, and executive function can be improved or supported to enhance our learning abilities over the lifespan. So what are these things? Attention is really about the focus of your conscious awareness. Attention researchers consider several aspects of that awareness. For example, sustained attention. This is the capacity to keep paying attention to something over a longer period of time. Divided attention involves switching your attentional focus back and forth between two different tasks. And selective attention means focusing on one thing among many competing and distracting items. So for example, listening to your spouse's voice in a crowded, noisy restaurant. Usually we assess these distinct capacities for attention in laboratory tasks that look at how well we can identify one item within an array of distracting items. That would be selective attention. How long we can track a particular image as it moves around. That would be sustained attention. And how well we can switch between two competing tasks, like watching a dot move around on a screen and identifying the shape it's tracing, while simultaneously responding to questions about whether words are spelled correctly, and that would assess divided attention. These ways of measuring attention show us that attention is a limited resource. We cannot pay attention to everything within our visual field, everything we hear, or for that matter, everything we feel. Unless you're wearing particularly uncomfortable clothes right now, you're probably not paying attention to the many tactile sensations from your clothing. For our purposes, attention plays a very important role in learning because what we don't attend to is often not learned. There are some exceptions to this, and they have to do with tacit learning, which we've mentioned earlier. But right now, I want to give you an illustration. Take a piece of paper right now and try to draw an accurate picture of a penny. Now, get out a real penny and take a look. Did you get anything wrong? When I did this exercise, I reversed the direction of Lincoln's face, I forgot the word liberty, and I put the date of the penny's minting on the wrong side of Lincoln's profile. For most of us, despite countless exposures to pennies, we've never really learned what a penny looks like in any detail. Why? Because you never had to pay attention to the kinds of details that would let you draw a penny accurately from your memory. In fact, what you have to attend to with a penny for everyday use is very minimal. The penny differs a little bit in size and very much in color from our other coins. So to recognize a penny, unless perhaps you live near the Canadian border, you don't need to pay attention to how it looks in any detail because those minimal cues of color and size suffice. And in fact, as an aside, it might be that Americans get more details right about their paper money than Europeans, whose currencies have always provided a bunch of size and color cues that go with what amount the paper money has. And by contrast, our US currency has always been more similar. All our bills, all our greenbacks look like one another. So we've had to pay at least some minimal attention to the illustrations on the face of a bill in order to distinguish them by amount. Attention is so powerful in ensuring that we learn things that attention researchers have discovered a series of phenomena which they label with terms like inattention blindness and change blindness and so on. And essentially, if you're not attending to something, even if you're looking right at that thing, you don't see it. And what we do not see, we often cannot learn. For example, in one study conducted by David Strayer and his colleagues, Participants drove a high-fidelity driving simulator, and that means it's very similar to normal driving. You're sitting in a seat, you have a windshield around you, and so on. And they drove in the simulator on a course that was populated with billboards, just like some of our highways. Now, some participants merely drove the course, and others did so while talking on a cell phone. Now, this latter condition, it represents a situation where participants' attention is divided. And remember, I told you attention is limited. So what this means is people can't pay as much attention to their driving and to the course that they're on. Now, as you may already know from the enormous media attention that Strayer's work has garnered, using a cell phone while you drive is a truly dangerous act. But for our purposes today, what's interesting to ask is whether people learned anything about the billboards they saw while they were driving. After participants finished driving, they were actually given a recognition memory test for those billboards to see if they'd learned them. They were shown billboards from their drive, but they were also shown similar billboards that weren't on their simulated drive. And what this does is it tests whether they're simply guessing. If they only had to say yes or no, they'd have a 50% chance of responding accurately, even if they guessed on every turn. Now, as it turns out, people's ability to recognize the billboards declines significantly if they drove the course while talking on a cell phone. And by using an eye tracker device, which can document where people's eyes are looking while they're engaged in some task, these researchers were able to show people were actually looking right at those billboards, even though later they weren't able to recognize them. In fact, this is actually directly analogous to the penny example, because despite looking at pennies over a lifetime, we still haven't actually learned the details of their features. Now, once you've paid attention to something, in most learning situations, that's not the end of it. Rather, we want to do something to the item that we're paying attention to. We're going to think about working memory as the kind of metaphorical mental space where you actively engage with material. For example, imagine that you really are trying to learn what a penny looks like. You begin by looking at that penny more carefully than you have before. You focus your attention on the way that the face of a penny is designed. You might ask yourself questions like, what are the features of a penny's face? And where are they located with respect to one another? As you think about these questions, you are engaging working memory capacity to learn the face of the penny. As you use this capacity, what you're doing is that you're making use of knowledge about measurements. You might estimate distances between the perimeter of the penny and the date, or consider whether the nose of Lincoln faces the date or not. Now, if this sounds suspiciously like the idea of elaborative encoding, it should. When we engage working memory in the service of learning, a few things are happening. First, it is within working memory that we are actively connecting new material we're trying to learn, to things we already know. And second, and maybe most important, the use of working memory need not be focused on learning specifically. In fact, we're likely to learn what we engage with in working memory, even if the reasons we're engaging with it are not explicitly for learning. So recall that the intention to learn mattered less in studies of wordless learning than how people thought about what they were learning and how they use the material later. So if you're planning to draw another penny picture, you'll be likely to learn the penny's face better than if you're not. Now, what we're likely to learn about our penny are the features we focus on in working memory. And in this example, you've already seen that you probably haven't ever tried to estimate how far from the perimeter the date is located or which way Lincoln's face is turned. And this is because while intending to learn or not learn information may not matter, intentions do influence what we pay attention to and how we engage with it in working memory. And this idea of intentions or goals brings us to the last and the broadest capability we're going to address today, and that's something we call executive function. Executive functions are the abilities that comprise planning, flexibility, and inhibition, and they're connected to the ways in which we deliberately employ and shift and focus our attentional capacity and make use of working memory capacity in the service of our goals. So let's discuss each of these executive functions: planning, flexibility, and inhibition. Planning means the capacity to think through a complicated task so that you don't make early and costly errors. You plan according to the rules of the task. So planning involves assessing the rules and the constraints on what you can do, and figuring out a solution that isn't going to violate those rules. An example of a typical laboratory task is called the Tower of Hanoi problem. In this problem, you have two platforms with 3 pegs on each, and they hold discs. And the rules are that you may move 1 disc at a time. Discs must always be on pegs. That is, you can't put a disc on the table while you figure something out. And you can't put a larger disc on top of a smaller disc. Now, the task you have is to match your task platform to a demonstration platform in terms of discs and how they're configured. So as you can see, the task requires you to visualize moves ahead. In other words, you have to plan your moves in order to avoid being in a situation where you can't actually follow the rules of the game. Flexibility is the capacity to change from one set of rules to another. For example, I might ask you to sort a series of cards with shapes of different colors on them. You could sort the cards by shape, or you could sort them by color, you could sort them by both. In a flexibility task, I might first ask you to sort in one way, and then later you have to switch. And the more errors you make when you have to switch, the lower your cognitive flexibility. Inhibition is the ability to ignore distracting information. For example, in what is called a Stroop task, I might ask you to look at a series of color words printed in different colors of ink. The words would be blue, red, yellow, green, and they'd be printed in blue, red, yellow, and green ink. Now, in some cases, the words are printed in the same color that they name, so you see red printed in red. But in other cases, red might be printed in blue. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to name the ink color, not to read the word. Now, in this task, the word meaning can become a distraction. It interferes with your task, which is to pay attention to the ink color. If I measure how quickly you respond in those conflicting cases versus the congruent cases where name and ink color match, I have a measure of how effectively you can inhibit or push away the distraction of the word meaning. The bigger that discrepancy, the more conflict slows you down, the more trouble you are having with inhibition of distracting items. Now, in terms of the brain, executive functions like planning, flexibility, and inhibition are housed, if you will, in the prefrontal cortex. And there's a sort of way in which this is a kind of more is better situation. More prefrontal cortex, or a larger prefrontal cortex, is typically better. And some of the best illustrations of this actually come from cross-species comparisons. I once saw a talk given by a neuroscientist named Shimamura, who's a professor at Berkeley. And he began his talk by talking about how difficult it is to train a cat versus a dog. For example, in my household, we want to train pets to stay off the kitchen table. And what Shimamura suggested is that even when you're very sure that both the cat and the dog understand that you are very displeased when they get on the table, and they stop doing it while you're standing there in your kitchen, your cat is probably only following the rules while you are physically present. And in my household, there are telltale paw prints to confirm Shimamura's conjecture. The dog actually might be trustworthy all day by himself. My dog is. And the difference, according to Shimamura, is the prefrontal cortex. Dogs have more than cats. As it turns out, different species of primates have different amounts of prefrontal cortex, and this actually matters for how well they do on executive function tasks. Consider for a minute the ability of inhibition and something called the reverse reward task. It's going to sound simple, but I assure you it's a hard task if you're an animal, and it's also a hard task if you're a young child or if you're very hungry. In the reverse reward task, I'm going to show you 2 different piles of food. And you're allowed to point to one. In fact, you have to point to one. Now here's the trick. You will get the pile you don't point towards. So if you're a laboratory monkey and you do this task, the way to win is to consistently point to or choose the smaller pile of food. But to do so, you need some serious inhibition because everything in your little monkey mind is telling you to look at and point at and want the big pile. So different species of primates do differently on a task like this, and the differences between them actually end up depending on the size of their prefrontal cortex. Chimps do well, for example, and lemurs not so well. And for the parents or the people in the audience who have a lot of experience with children and teenagers, this probably won't shock you. Different ages of human beings also have different amounts of prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is one of the latest maturing parts of our brains. There's clear evidence that this part of our brain is still maturing into the mid-20s. It's also an area of significant age-related decline in later adulthood. So a person's ability to plan and shift strategies and inhibit distracting, extraneous information doesn't fully form until he or she is over 20 years old. And from my perspective, this can explain an awful lot about frustrating exchanges parents have with adolescents. So why do executive functions matter? Well, if attention and working memory are so critical for learning, and executive functions let you direct and control attention and working memory processes, and more broadly, they let you direct and control your behavior, you can see why these abilities probably matter for learning. It's these abilities that help to determine what gets perceived and encoded, and how well you can retrieve that information or engage in that skill later on. And the evidence that executive function abilities matter for learning and beyond is easy to come by. To give you just one example, Clark and colleagues conducted an important longitudinal study of kids' mathematics learning in the early elementary years. And they were interested in how well kids did with math learning as a function of the level of executive function they displayed prior to school at the preschool years, so maybe age 4 or so. And to look at this, they used an assessment of math that involved basic addition and subtraction problems. And for 6-year-olds, this is kind of the bread and butter. This is what math is. Clark and colleagues found that executive function skills at age 4 were strongly predictive of math performance at age 6. This was true regardless of the kid's overall IQ and reading ability, both of which are related to early math abilities. So specifically, kids' ability to shift, kids' flexibility, and their ability to inhibit distractions were quite important for predicting how well they would do on addition and subtraction when they were 6 years old. Now, how does this work, really? The role of executive function here could operate in at least 2 ways. So first, in a test of addition and subtraction, just being able to do the problems is going to be affected by your ability to inhibit distractions and to shift tasks. You have to shift from one to another strategy in solving the problems, and you have to inhibit distracting elements both on the test and around you in the room. For example, the fact that a test might have multiple problems poses some distractions. Importantly, though, in this case, the associations that the researchers were finding were not between executive functioning and math performance at the same age. Rather, they looked at executive functioning when the kids were 4, and they were using that to predict how they would do on math at age 6. So in this case, the researchers argued that executive function abilities in preschool influenced how well children were able to learn math. In other words, it's difficulties in being flexible about strategies and inhibiting distractions that affect kids' learning of mathematics, not necessarily a native ability or inability to learn the principles of math, and not necessarily the ability to do well at the test in one point in time. Now, all this makes it important to ask whether we can enhance attention, working memory, and executive function, and how we might do that. So as it turns out, researchers are identifying ways to improve these capacities to make people's learning more effective and more efficient. And today, I'm going to focus on 4 approaches that are yielding at least some preliminary success. So in looking at these 4 approaches, we're going to move from what is, I think, the most obvious to what I think is the most surprising and the most fun. So strategy 1 is to get yourself something called variable priority training. Variable priority training was developed as a method of improving people's ability to do 2 things at once. And if you think about it, the main way executive function and attentional processes serve learning is by allowing us to focus on different aspects of the material we're learning, and also to manage what we're trying to learn and other competing demands on our time and attention. So it could well be that variable priority training is a way to enhance executive function. Here's how it works. In variable priority training, people are asked to learn to do 2 different tasks at the same time. But they're asked to shift their priorities around so that at some points in time, task 1 is more important, and at others, task 2 is more important. Variable priority training is performed in laboratories with laboratory-like tasks. And that means that one of the major issues with these approaches is what's called transfer. Now, transfer refers to whether learning one kind of task, like the one that was used for variable priority training, whether learning that task is actually going to benefit you in some other task. And for our purposes, what this means is if you learn variable priority training with one pair of tasks, is it really going to help you with executive function more broadly and learning capacity in everyday life? And we don't yet know for sure whether variable priority training can improve executive function and learning. Now, in one study, Art Kramer and his colleagues looked at older and younger adults, and what they asked them to do for variable priority training was to learn to simultaneously perform what's called an alphabet-arithmetic task and, hold on to your seats here, to monitor a set of 6 gauges that changed continuously. Periodically, participants had to reset a gauge when it entered the red phase. And if they didn't do this after a little bit of time, the computer would reset the gauge, and that was counted as an error. Now, while they're monitoring the gauges, participants are asked to do the alphabet-arithmetic task. And this consists of problems like k minus 3 equals, and the answer to that problem is h. So these problems always involved adding or subtracting 2 or 3 letters. And the participants also had to tell whether the answer was lower or higher than the letter on the previous trial. And it was self-paced, so the measure of success in this particular task, in the alphabet-arithmetic task, is how many problems you solve over the course of the task period. Now, if your head is not spinning yet, you also had a bar on the screen, and the bar on the screen would let you know 2 things. The first thing the bar let you know, depending on where it was divided, was how much you should prioritize the alphabet-arithmetic task or the gauge monitoring task. And sometimes you were to place high priority on the gauges, and at others you were supposed to place higher priority on the arithmetic task. And the second thing the bar did was it showed you how well you were doing at the 2 tasks. So perfect performance would color the entire bar in on both sides of the dividing line, and when the bar wasn't completely colored in, it showed you that you were getting things wrong. Whew! So Kramer and colleagues gave people 2 kinds of training on this dual task. Now, in one type, people were always asked to place equal priority on the 2 tasks, so that bar was always divided right in the middle. In the other type, people were asked to place different priorities on each task at different times. And then they looked at whether people got better at doing both tasks, and more importantly, this was the transfer issue, they looked at whether people also showed improvement when they were given a different set of dual tasks to do, and this different set involved scheduling and memorizing pairs of associated words. So to cut to the chase, variable priority training produced better results than fixed priority training, and this was true for older and younger adults. It was also true for both being able to perform the training tasks, alphabet arithmetic and gauge monitoring, and for being able to perform the quite different tasks of memorizing words and scheduling. So, unless you were completely horrified by my description, you might be asking where you can get access to variable priority training. Well, variable priority training is being built into software packages for improving cognitive function among adults and for better preparing young children for school. I'm going to have to caution you, however, because these products are not always tested, and you're probably not surprised to learn that they depart from the kinds of laboratory tasks that have been well evaluated in order to create a more marketable and appealing product. So, caveat emptor. Variable priority training seems to work, but it's very hard work. The tasks are absolutely not appealing, and it requires you to draw on motivational resources. Fortunately, research is suggesting there are some other options. A second strategy, and one I like a little better, is mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness meditation is a practice originating in Buddhist traditions, and it's geared towards increasing people's mindfulness. What is that? Mindfulness is characterized by 2 major features. One is full attention to the current moment-to-moment experiences that you're having, both internal and external. And second, mindfulness involves an attitude of openness and non-judgment. Now, mindfulness meditation has been incorporated into a number of psychological treatments for mental disorders and physical disorders. It's linked to many positive outcomes for people who practice it. So people who practice mindfulness meditation report higher well-being, they report more control over substance use, lower blood pressure, they have less emotional distress, and there are clear benefits for chronic pain and other physical disorders. However, mindfulness could also help to expand attentional capacity because it encourages people to focus their awareness in the present rather than being distracted by concerns about the past or the future. And a recent review of a number of studies suggests some evidence for precisely that. Mindfulness meditation practices appear linked to improvements in attention, working memory, and executive function. Long-term meditators show better performance on these types of abilities as well. So, quality variable priority training and mindfulness meditation are two strategies for improving executive functioning, for improving your ability to plan, to switch from unsuccessful strategies to more useful ones, and to improve your focus and your ability to inhibit distractions. Two other cool strategies specific to improving and maintaining executive function, and so potentially to strengthen learning, are bilingualism and dramatic play. And these are also relatively recent lines of investigation. So let's start with bilingualism. Ellen Bialystok and her collaborators have been studying bilingual individuals for many years. Broadly speaking, they think of someone as bilingual if the person regularly uses two languages. Their initial work focused on the implications of being bilingual for language development. But subsequently, they expanded their work to begin looking at how bilingualism influences nonverbal aspects of cognition, and their findings were very surprising. As it turned out, people who were bilingual show above average performance on working memory capacity and executive function. And they're particularly good at inhibiting distractions and at switching between tasks or flexibility. Now, Bialystok speculates that this is because in order to switch back and forth effectively between two languages, people need to use those executive abilities. And they've been able to show the same effects across a lot of different languages. So doesn't matter which two languages people are speaking, only that they're speaking two languages. And these advantages for bilinguals get bigger over time. That is, the way that bilingualism helps executive function gets more and more evident as people grow older and enter an age where executive function is often on the decline. Some evidence actually is suggesting that bilingualism may even be a protective factor against dementia. So these are more good reasons to study second languages. There are some caveats, however. And first, it's just not clear if people who learn a language later in their lives will experience the same benefits as people who've been bilingual from early in their lives. And it also isn't clear what happens if people once functioned as bilinguals, as I did in Germany for my postdoc years, but now largely function as monolinguals, as I do now that I've returned to my native country. My favorite strategy to improve executive function is to play. There are a lot of computer games that are getting developed for these purposes, and those aren't really well tested for the most part. Some more trustworthy and really beautiful findings have emerged from some work done by Adele and her collaborators. And what they've done is they've shown that getting young children, very elementary school age, 4, 5, 6-year-old children, to engage in dramatic play. And by dramatic play, I mean the old school role-playing and pretending kind of dramatic play, playing house. This improves executive functions. Now, this is probably because this kind of play requires kids to take turns, to wait to talk, to inhibit some of their actions, and to pay a lot of attention to what is happening around them, to what their friends are doing, so that their responses make sense within the game. I love these findings for a few reasons. So first, they apply to at-risk children. Diamond and her colleagues were studying kids whose initial executive function when they got to preschool wasn't very good. And we know already that that's a risk factor for academic performance later on. The second thing they do is they underscore the immense value of having a broad curriculum for children, not a narrow specialization early on. And finally, they suggest to me that as adults, we might maintain and even optimize executive function by doing a little more playing ourselves. And I think this is a low-risk thing to try because even if it doesn't really help executive function for adults, it probably will make your life a lot more fun. So attention, working memory, and executive function are important in supporting learning. And variable priority training, mindfulness meditation, learning another language, and playing more may help us sharpen and maintain those abilities. What attention, working memory, and executive function also let us do is to monitor our learning. And next lecture, we'll think more about monitoring learning and choosing strategies.